Hi all, and welcome to this video, and we're going to do a series of videos for A-level Sport and Society revision. So we'll look at topic 1, which is popular recreation, and so it's kind of the initial emergence of sport pre-1780 in Britain. So when you think of history of sport, you don't have to go all the way back to the ancient Greeks. We're really primarily looking at the development of sport in Britain. Okay, so we're going to look at the characteristics. Okay, and there are some revision tools for those as well, and I'll teach you those as you go along. What I want to do though is link those to the social, cultural factors of the time. Now, when you come to answer questions, they're the really important part. So you have to know the characteristic, and you have to be able to link it to society in some way, and that will then be able to allow you to access as many marks as possible, because most of the questions look at the social and cultural factors that affect the characteristics of popular recreation. Okay, how sport and society link. So the first one we'll look at is occasional. So popular recreation pre-1780, we're talking about sport being only played really occasionally, particularly by the lower class, the peasants. Okay, so the reason for that was they worked 6 days a week, and on a Sunday they were banned from doing recreation by the church. They had to go to church and do very little else. Okay, so they couldn't do sport and recreation on a Sunday. Now, they also had limited free time in evenings to participate in any activities as well, because they worked often in agriculture or in farming, and therefore worked long hours all day, often daylight hours. So as it got dark, they sort of finished work, and as it got light, they started work. And that meant there was very little time afterwards to participate in sport. Now, the next one we'll look at is rural, and that sort of links to what I've just said. Most of the population in Great Britain at the time lived in the countryside, okay? And so most of them lived in the countryside in farming or agricultural based jobs. And very few people in comparison lived in the major towns and cities pre-1780. Most people worked on farms because so much manpower was needed in farming. The next one is cruel and violent. So a lot of sports were cruel and violent, and that's because society was a lot more harsh. There wasn't organised policing. Law and order was taken on by local landowners, and people treated each other violently to settle arguments and disputes, and that was reflected particularly in peasants' popular recreation such as mob football. Now, for the wealthier, they didn't really have violent sports, but they still had some cruel sports. They're still involved in animal hunting, etc. Okay, the next one was sport was local. You only really played sport against people near to you, so we're often just the people in your village, the people that you know, and you probably only played what we call as holy days, and those holy days were where you were given a day off, often for a day linked to the church, such as Shrove Tuesday or Ash Wednesday, Good Friday, and you might have a feast on that day. You might have celebrations. It might be a wake, so it might be a celebration of one of the wealthier members of the estate, and it might be the anniversary of one of their birthdays or one of their deaths, and so you'd have a celebration of that time. You couldn't travel very far, so people didn't travel because there was no railways, there were no cars. You had to be quite wealthy to own a horse or a carriage, so if you want to go anywhere you had to walk, and so people didn't really do that. They may have played the next village if it was relatively local, but otherwise they're going to only do activity within the people in their village. Okay, and the next one, simple and unwritten rules. So simple and unwritten rules are because there was low levels of literacy. The poor really couldn't read or write. They didn't get education. From children, they often went into some kind of work only if they were lucky were in an area where the church ran a church school. May they learn some education and some literacy. So literacy levels were really, really low, and only the really wealthy could read or write. Remember, we're in a two-tier system. We've got the haves and the have-nots, the super wealthy upper class landowners and the poor, particularly in rural settings. That's the two-class system you had, and the poor really couldn't read and write. So there's no point in having a rule book because they couldn't read it. So the rules were really limited and simple so they could understand and then play those games. So, for example, in mob football, you might have where the ball had to get to be scored. There might not be any restrictions on the number of players or boundaries of where the game is going to be played. And essentially what we're looking at is don't kill each other. Okay, get the ball to here, and other than that, get it any way you can. Now, the upper classes, because they had literacy skills, could play sports that were slightly more complicated, such as real tennis. Now, real tennis, even in today's levels of education, will be seen as relatively a tricky game to play with complicated rules, and they'd be passed on. They could be written down, and scoring could be written down as well. Next one, we've got the facilities. So you use natural facilities and natural equipment. Okay, there's no high technology. It's really simple, basic equipment, and we only need to look at cricket for that. So we look at cricket, even today, the bat is made of wood, the stumps are made of wood, the ball is made of leather, all natural materials, and you play it on grass. Now, they really do have their origins way back in time. In fact, cricket's one of the first governing bodies and the first to have rules. And in many ways, a bit of a pioneer, because the upper classes mixed with the lower classes to make teams, because you need 11 players, and often you didn't have 11 players in the upper class in your household to play. So you brought in good players or people with physical attributes from your kind of like local population, okay, to play against other teams locally. And you'd need a grass meadow or a village green, and you'd play it on there. We still see that today. There are still lots of villages where cricket is played on village green areas, and the pub nearby is called the Cricketers. That's all got their origins in this period of time as well. Wagering is the last one. Now, wagering occurred by both lower class and upper classes, and wagering was something that occurred for the lower classes because it was a way of getting out of poverty. They saw it as a way of getting from rags to riches. Okay, really quick way. People still see that today. There's still kind of big gambling issues with people in poverty who want to get out of poverty. Now, in the upper classes, they would have gambled against maybe somebody else of wealth as almost fun. Okay, so they'd done it in that way. You also got patronage, where a wealthy upper class landowner or gentleman may own a lower class boxer and set up boxing matches for them, and that's often for prize money and wagering situations. Now, typical exam questions on this come about for comparison as well. So you might get asked, look at mob football and link the socio-cultural factors of the time to explain why mob football was like it. So you'd say mob football was violent because society was violent. There were no police force. People settled arguments by violence. It wasn't frowned upon as much as it is now. Mob football was played by people with low levels of literacy. Therefore, we didn't have many rules. Okay, so they're the kind of things you're going to write in those. Now, often what they'll do is they'll bring an example of such as real tennis. And they'll say, how does that compare to mob football? Both played about the same time. Now, real tennis, you'll say, was played by upper classes with high levels of literacy, excellent skill and fitness, compared to lower classes who had low levels of literacy, so had to play basic games and were violent because their culture was violent. Real tennis was not violent because the upper classes were more refined and played to beat each other, okay, didn't play to hurt each other. Both may have had wagering, so if you're looking for a link, both may have had wagering involved. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I'm going to try and produce a few more for the whole of Sport and Society A Level, particularly for Year 1.